Hello! During this semester, we have been studying the complex relation, past and present, between East Asia and the West, between domination, technological and cultural exchanges, economic and military competition. Their exchanges have been many and varied. But what about Africa? I'm going to try to answer this past question by telling you about the links between Africa and China through the ages. I invite you to listen to this mini course entitled China Meet Africa. Let's start at the beginning. The first recorded exchanges between China and Africa can be traced back to the Middle Ages. China's ceramics have been found in Zimbabwe dating from the 7th century, and Chinese coins from the Tang dynasty have been found on the coast of Swali. From 1405 to 1433, under the Ming dynasty, Zhang He, then admiral of the imperial fleet, undertook several expeditions to Africa. At the time, the Chinese fleet was the largest in the world, with 69 ships and 30,000 men. These expeditions were marked by numerous commercial exchanges. Giraffe, considered an almost legendary animal in China, were exchanged for Chinese porcelain in Malindi, the actual Kenya. Ivory and animals such as zebra and camel were traded for gold, silver, and silk. Diplomatic relations were thus established between China and Malindi. Most of these expeditions were retraced by Ma Huan, Admiral Zheng He's traveling companion, and were compiled in a document called Wonder of the Oceans. In it, he took note of geography, laws, politics, customs, and climatic conditions of the territories explored. But these exchanges were interrupted when China gave up on deep sea shipping in 1436. It wasn't until the arrival of the Portuguese in Asia in the 16th century that trade began again, though indirectly, between China and Africa, with Macao being a hub for those trades. The Portuguese trading post ensured the exchange of goods and people between the two territories. In the 19th century, Chinese people migrated to Africa, often under duress, and more than 64,000 Chinese workers, called coolies, arrived in South Africa between 1840 and the 900 in the 1900 to work, for example, in the Transvaal gold mines. The living conditions of those workers were deplorable, closer to slavery than anything else. Many Chinese never returned to China, and this was at the origin of Chinese communities in southern Africa. It was also at this time that the first formal diplomatic relations between the two territories were established, with the opening of a Chinese consulate in Zanzibar in 1879. It was not until 1950 that direct relations were established again between China and Africa. With the birth of the People's Republic of China in 1949, Mao Zedong adopted an African policy aimed at supporting liberation movements around the world, thus opposing the colonialists of the time. Relations were no longer merely material but ideological. This led to the training of 10,000 African militants in Chinese military academies and the construction of the Tazara Railway linking Tanzania and Zambia by Chinese, which was to become a symbol of South-South cooperation. The priority at the time was technical training, agriculture, and above all, the presence of qualified health and education personnel. In Algeria, China also supplied arms to the FLN during the War of Independence and played an active role in post-colonial reconstruction. This aid was given by China not only because of the moral values it represented, but also because it was calculated. China gained allies, many small allies, each not very powerful but numerous. One of its aims at the time was to isolate Taiwan, for example, and its aid to Africa meant that only four African countries recognized it in 1971. China also saw it as a way of challenging the Soviet regime. After Mao's death, Xi Jinping reoriented African policies toward more economic interests. One of its first goals was to secure sustainable access to Africa's primary resources such as minerals and energy. For example, it signed oil agreements with Nigeria and Liberia, and at the time many Chinese were moving to Africa to do business. Moreover, it will represent a model of development in Africa. China is inviting the various African countries to reproduce its model of development in order to succeed. China is also continuing to strengthen its diplomatical ties, for example by supplying enough medicines to Liberia in 1999 to contain the last fever epidemic. Since then, trade between the two territories has intensified considerably, thanks in particular to Chinese projects for a new Silk Road and in particular maritime routes. In 2013, Sino-African trade exceeded $200 billion. China has become Africa's leading trading partner, and for example, it received 28% of Africa's oil exports and has built around 45% of Africa's major infrastructure. 100,000 kilometers of roads and 1,000 bridges were built, the major port of Churchill in Algeria too, and a growing number of mining and energy contracts were made. China has become a major investor. It is also developing its diplomatic and social relations. Numerous Confucius institutes have been set up, and scholarships for African students have been granted. There is also visa agreements and cooperation in the health sector. For instance, it provided more than 1 billion vaccines during the COVID epidemic. And with all of those actions, China is developing its soft power in Africa. Nonetheless, this relation are totally asymmetrical. Although Sino-African trade amount to USD 295 billion, the African trade uh, deficit is USD 62 billion. Chinese is for manufactured goods, while Africa mainly sells raw materials such as oil, minerals, and wood. And what's more, China's presence in Africa is attracting fierce criticism in Europe because it is in indirect competition with the former colonial powers. In addition, there are new African protests calling into question the Chinese presence because the working conditions imposed by Chinese companies on local population are difficult and the interests are not equal. Africa is also beginning to realize that it's technologically dependent on China and that its 160 billion debt to China make it vulnerable. This partnership is now showing its limits. To conclude, relations between China and Africa are above all peaceful. There has never been any conflict between China and Africa. This relation began with economic and diplomatic relations during the Middle Ages and became ideological in the 20th century when it was necessary to support the anti-colonial movement. Today, a genuine An economic and political partnership has been established between Africa and China, but it remains highly unbalanced in favor of China. If we are to hope for a lasting agreement between the two territories, we need a rebalancing that will enable Africa to develop in the long term. Thank you for listening.